My son became a millionaire and gave me a house. 3 months later, he died in a car crash. The next day, his wife showed up at my door with her new boyfriend. This house is mine now. Go grieve somewhere else. I left, but my hidden cameras stayed, and the police loved what they saw. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I'm Dorothy Williams, 67 years old, and I thought I'd seen the worst of human nature during my 35 years teaching high school. Boy, was I wrong. Nothing prepared me for what my own daughter-in-law would do the day after we buried my son. It was a gray Tuesday morning when Tiffany showed up at my front door, clicking her acrylic nails against her designer purse. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man I'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing work boots and a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Dorothy, we need to talk," Tiffany announced, pushing past me into the foyer without invitation. The nerve of that woman never ceased to amaze me. "About what, dear?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Marcus had been dead exactly 24 hours. The funeral flowers were still fresh in the living room. "About this house," she gestured around with theatrical drama. "Rick here is a contractor. We've been discussing some renovations." Rick. So that was his name. I studied his face, noting the way his eyes appraised my home,
The transition,
like he was already
moving from the city
calculating
to the
square
countryside,
footage.
that really
"I don't
defined
understand,"
who I am
I
today.
said
It was
slowly.
scary, but
"Marcus gave me
absolutely
this
necessary
house
for my
3 months ago. The deed is in my name." Tiffany's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, honey, there's so much you don't understand. See, Marcus was planning to contest that little gift. He told me all about it, said giving you the house was a mistake, that you manipulated him when he was vulnerable after his promotion." My chest tightened. Marcus had given me this house freely, lovingly, after his company went public, and he'd made more money than he'd ever dreamed. We'd stood right here in this very foyer when he handed me the keys, tears in his eyes as he hugged me. "That's not true," I whispered. "Isn't it?" Tiffany stepped closer, her perfume cloying and overwhelming. "Face it, Dorothy. You're an old woman with nowhere else to go. Marcus felt sorry for you, but he was going to fix his mistake. Since he can't do it himself anymore, I'm handling it for him." Rick spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and unpleasant. "Look, lady, we can do this easy or hard, but we're moving in next week. The renovation starts Monday." I stared at them both, my mind reeling. Yesterday, I'd buried my only child. Today, his wife was throwing me out of my home with a stranger who talked like a thug. "I need time to process this," I said finally. "You have until Friday," Tiffany replied, checking her phone like this conversation bored her. "Rick needs to start the demolition on the kitchen. We're going completely open concept." They left without another word, climbing into a massive pickup truck that definitely hadn't belonged to my refined son. I watched them drive away, something dark and determined growing in my chest. If Tiffany thought she could bulldoze Dorothy Williams, she was about to learn otherwise. Let me take you back 3 months to understand how this nightmare began. It was December, and Marcus had just called with news that his tech startup had been acquired for $47 million. $47 million. My son, who used to beg me for lunch money in high school. "Mom, I want to do something special for you," he'd said over dinner at my favorite restaurant. "Something to show you how grateful I am for everything you sacrificed for me." I'd raised Marcus alone after his father died when he was 12. Worked 2 jobs, sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay for his computer programming courses, lived on ramen noodles so he could have proper clothes for job interviews. Not once did I regret it. "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart," I'd told him that night. "I disagree." His eyes were bright with excitement. "I bought you a house, Mom. Your dream house." The house was a beautiful colonial on Maple Street, the same neighborhood where I'd window shopped during my evening walks for years. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard perfect for the garden I'd always wanted. "Marcus, I can't accept this," I'd protested, even as my heart soared. "You can, and you will. The deed is already in your name. Consider it a very late Christmas present for all the Christmases I couldn't afford to give you anything decent." Tiffany had been notably quiet during this conversation. She'd married Marcus 2 years earlier, a whirlwind romance that started when she was his dental hygienist. 24 years old to his 39, blonde and beautiful, and utterly captivated by his sudden wealth. "What does Tiffany think about this?" I'd asked gently. Tiffany understands how important you are to me, Marcus had replied, though I noticed he didn't look at his wife when he said it. Now, standing in that same kitchen 3 months later, I wondered if I'd been naive to believe that. Had Tiffany resented the gift from the beginning? Had she been planning this takeover even then? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the breakfast nook, thinking. Marcus had been acting strange the past few weeks before the accident. Distracted, jumpy, checking his phone constantly. I'd attributed it to stress from managing his new wealth, but what if it was something else? What if it was something more sinister? The accident itself had been suspicious. Marcus was an excellent driver, cautious to a fault. Yet somehow he'd missed a curve on a road he'd driven hundreds of times and slammed into a tree at 60 miles per hour. No skid marks, the police said, like he'd never even tried to brake. And now, less than 24 hours after we'd lowered him into the ground, Tiffany was moving in with another man, a man she seemed awfully comfortable with for someone she'd supposedly just met. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old colleague Helen, who'd married a private investigator after retirement. Helen, it's Dorothy Williams. I need a favor, and I need it to be discreet. Some mothers teach their children to turn the other cheek. I taught mine to fight back when cornered. Time to follow my own lesson. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because I was lying awake, wondering why Marcus hadn't returned my calls from the previous day. When the phone rang, displaying unknown number, my blood turned to ice. Is this Dorothy Williams, mother of Marcus Williams? The voice was professional, clinical. Yes, this is Dorothy. What's happened? Ma'am, I'm Officer Patterson with the state police. I'm afraid there's been an accident involving your son. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the phone with both hands, my knuckles white. What kind of accident? A single-car collision on Route 47, near Miller's Bend. Mr. Williams' vehicle left the roadway and struck a tree. I'm very sorry to inform you that he was pronounced dead at the scene. The words didn't register at first. They bounced off my consciousness like rain on a window. Marcus, dead? Impossible. I'd just talked to him Sunday. He'd promised to come by Tuesday for dinner. There must be some mistake, I whispered. I'm afraid not, ma'am. We'll need someone to identify the body and collect his personal effects. The next hours passed in a blur of paperwork, fluorescent lights, and the overwhelming smell of disinfectant at the morgue. Marcus looked peaceful lying there, like he was simply sleeping. No visible injuries, except for a small cut on his forehead. For a crash violent enough to kill him instantly, he looked remarkably intact. Was he wearing his seatbelt? I asked the coroner. A kind-faced woman named Dr. Martinez. Yes, properly fastened. The cause of death was internal trauma from the impact. He wouldn't have suffered. That should have comforted me, but it didn't. Something felt wrong about the whole thing. Tiffany arrived an hour later, dressed in black Lululemon and designer sunglasses, tears streaming down her face in perfectly controlled rivulets that didn't smudge her makeup. She threw herself into my arms with dramatic sobs. Oh, Dorothy, what are we going to do without him? Even in my grief, I noticed she smelled like cologne, a masculine scent that definitely wasn't Marcus's usual subtle aftershave. This was heavier, more aggressive, construction worker cologne. The funeral was 3 days later. Marcus had always hated pomp and circumstance, so we kept it simple. Just family, close friends, and a few colleagues from his company. I spoke about the son who'd built me a computer when I was afraid of technology, who'd called every Sunday without fail, who'd never forgotten to send flowers on Mother's Day. Tiffany spoke about her beloved husband and their beautiful future together that was cut so tragically short. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, but I noticed the tears had dried up conveniently fast. After the service, as we gathered at the graveside, I spotted him. A tall man in a dark suit standing apart from the crowd, watching the proceedings with interest rather than grief. When our eyes met, he turned away quickly, but not before I noticed his face. It was Rick, the contractor. At my son's funeral, a full day before Tiffany would introduce him as her new whatever he was. How long had they known each other? How long had this been going on? Standing there watching dirt fall onto my son's casket, a terrible possibility began forming in my mind. An idea so horrific I tried to push it away, but it clung like smoke. What if Marcus's accident wasn't an accident at all? The morning after Tiffany's ultimatum, I woke up with crystalline clarity about what I needed to do. For 35 years, I'd taught teenagers how to think critically, how to gather evidence, how to build an argument. Time to put those skills to work. First stop, the police station. Detective Sarah Collins was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She listened patiently as I explained my concerns about Marcus's accident. "Mrs. Williams, I understand you're grieving, but sometimes families look for explanations when there aren't any complex ones. Your son had been drinking that night." "Drinking?" That stopped me cold. Marcus rarely drank, maybe a beer with dinner. The toxicology report showed a blood alcohol level of 0.12, well over the legal limit. I stared at her. That's impossible. Marcus was nearly obsessive about not drinking and driving. His college roommate died in a drunk driving accident. Detective Collins pulled out a file. The report also showed trace amounts of alprazolam in his system, anxiety medication. The combination can be particularly dangerous. Marcus wasn't taking any anxiety medication. I'd have known. "Ma'am, with respect, adult children don't always share everything with their parents. Your son had recently come into significant wealth. That kind of sudden change can cause stress, lead to substance use." I wanted to argue, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. To her, I was just another grieving mother, unwilling to accept an uncomfortable truth about her child. "What about his wife?" I asked. "Have you looked into her background?" "Mrs. Williams, are you suggesting your daughter-in-law had something to do with this?" When she said it out loud, it sounded ridiculous, like something from a bad TV movie. "I'm just asking if you've investigated all possibilities. We conducted a thorough investigation. There's no evidence of foul play. I'm sorry for your loss, but sometimes accidents are just accidents." I left the station frustrated, but not defeated. If the police wouldn't investigate properly, I'd have to do it myself. My next stop was Marcus's house. Well, Tiffany's house now. I still had a key, and technically I had until Friday to collect any personal belongings. Time to see what I could learn. The house felt wrong the moment I walked in. Tiffany had already started packing away Marcus's things, his photos replaced with generic artwork, his books boxed up like they'd never mattered. It looked like someone trying very hard to erase all evidence that Marcus Williams had ever lived there. In his home office, I found his laptop. Password protected, of course, but I knew my son. His password had been the same since college. Dorothy 1956, my name and birth year. What I found made my blood run cold. The browsing history showed Marcus had been researching divorce lawyers. Not just casual browsing, he'd filled out consultation request forms with 3 different firms, all dated within the 2 weeks before his death. More disturbing were his recent bank statements. Large cash withdrawals, much larger than his usual spending patterns. 10,000 here, 15,000 there. Always in cash. Always on days when Tiffany had been out of town for her frequent spa weekends. The last entry was the most telling. A transfer of $50,000 to an account I didn't recognize, completed just 3 days before his death. I heard a car in the driveway. Tiffany was back. Quickly, I photographed the bank statements with my phone and closed the laptop. By the time Tiffany walked through the front door with her arms full of shopping bags, I was innocently sorting through Marcus's book collection. "Dorothy, what are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp with suspicion. "Collecting some of Marcus's things. You said I had until Friday." She set down her bags and watched me carefully. "Take whatever you want. Most of it's going to charity anyway." I held up a photo of Marcus at his college graduation. He was so proud that day. "Do you mind if I take this?" "Sure." Her answer was too quick, too careless for someone discussing mementos of their dead husband. As I packed Marcus's things, I made a decision. Tiffany could have the house. She could play grieving widow for the cameras. But she'd forgotten one crucial detail. She was dealing with a woman who'd spent decades outsmarting teenagers. And if there was one thing I'd learned in all those years, it was that everyone eventually reveals their true nature. They just need the right audience. Friday morning arrived with the kind of cold rain that seeps into your bones. I stood in my empty kitchen, watching Tiffany and Rick direct a crew of movers like they were staging a military operation. They'd given me until noon to clear out completely. I'd spent the previous 3 days making arrangements, finding a furnished apartment across town, and most importantly, installing my insurance policy. "Dorothy, you about ready?" Rick called out, his tone falsely cheerful. Up close, I could see he was handsome in a rough way, the kind of man who probably charmed women easily, the kind Marcus would have hated. "Almost finished," I replied, wheeling my last suitcase toward the door. Tiffany appeared from the living room, surveying the space like a queen claiming her kingdom. "We really appreciate you being so understanding about this, Dorothy. I know it's hard, but Marcus would have wanted what's best for both of us." The audacity was breathtaking. She was rewriting history in real time, making herself the reasonable one in this scenario. "Of course, dear," I said sweetly. "I just want what Marcus would have wanted too." What I didn't mention was the 4 tiny cameras I'd strategically placed throughout the house over the past 3 days. State-of-the-art devices, no bigger than shirt buttons, wireless and completely undetectable unless you knew exactly where to look. My friend Helen's husband had been most helpful in selecting the right equipment. For home security, I'd told him, which wasn't entirely a lie. 2 cameras covered the living room from different angles. 1 monitored the kitchen and dining area. The 4th was positioned in Marcus's old office, now apparently destined to become Rick's man cave. Each camera fed to an app on my phone and a backup drive that would store everything automatically. Whatever Tiffany and Rick were planning, I'd have a front row seat. "Well," I said, taking one last look around the home my son had given me, "I suppose this is goodbye." Tiffany actually had the nerve to hug me. "You take care of yourself, Dorothy. And remember, you're always welcome to visit. Visit. In my own house." The woman had steel nerves, I'll give her that. I drove away slowly, checking my rearview mirror until the house disappeared behind the trees. Then I pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop 6 blocks away and opened the camera app on my phone. Perfect. Crystal clear video of Tiffany and Rick already making themselves at home, Rick's tools scattered across my kitchen counter as they discussed phase 1 of their renovation. I ordered a large coffee and settled in to watch the show. It didn't take long for things to get interesting. By 3 p.m., Rick had made 3 phone calls that caught my attention. The first was to someone named Jimmy, confirming a meeting for that evening. The second was to a local bank, asking about expediting the insurance paperwork. The third was the most telling, a conversation with someone he called Babe, who was definitely not Tiffany. "Yeah, it's working perfectly," Rick said, his back to the camera as he stood in my kitchen. "The old lady bought the whole grieving widow act. We should have the insurance money within a month." Insurance money. My pulse quickened. Tiffany appeared in frame, wrapping her arms around Rick's waist from behind. "What about the police investigation?" "What investigation? They ruled it an accident. Case closed." Rick turned in her arms, and I could see his smug expression clearly. "Your boy Marcus made this almost too easy, getting drunk that night." "He didn't get drunk," Tiffany corrected, her voice cold. "You made sure of that." The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped my phone with trembling hands, making sure the audio was recording clearly. "Details, babe. The important thing is it worked. One little slip of something extra in his drink, wait for him to get behind the wheel, and boom, problem solved. They'd killed him. They'd actually killed my son." Rick's next words made my blood turn to ice. "Now we just need to make sure dear old Dorothy doesn't get suspicious and start poking around where she doesn't belong." I closed the app and sat in the coffee shop, staring at my phone. I had them. I had everything. But as I listened to their casual discussion of murdering my child, I realized something that chilled me more than their confession. They weren't finished, and I was still on their list. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my sterile apartment, watching the camera feeds on my laptop while taking detailed notes. By morning, I had enough evidence to bury them both, if I could stay alive long enough to use it. The breakthrough came around midnight when Rick's friend Jimmy arrived at the house. Jimmy turned out to be a nervous, twitchy man in his 50s who kept looking around like he expected police to burst through the doors. "You sure this is smart?" Jimmy asked, accepting a beer from Rick. "Meeting here with all this heat?" "What heat? The cops bought the whole thing. Drunk driving accident. Case closed." Rick settled into Marcus's favorite recliner like he owned it. "Besides, we need to talk about phase 2. Phase 2. My stomach clenched. Tiffany joined them, curling up next to Rick on the sofa. How much longer before the insurance pays out? 3 weeks? Maybe 4, Jimmy replied. But there's a complication. The old lady's been asking questions. Called my cousin at the police station twice this week. I'd done no such thing, but apparently my single visit to Detective Collins had made an impression. What kind of questions? Rick's voice had turned dangerous. About the toxicology report, about whether they tested for other substances besides alcohol. The three of them sat in silence for a moment. Then Tiffany spoke, her voice matter-of-fact in a way that made my skin crawl. Maybe Dorothy needs to have an accident too. Tiff, that's... Jimmy started. Jimmy? What? She's old. She's been acting erratic since Marcus died. Who would question it if she fell down some stairs? Or maybe had a little car trouble on one of those winding country roads she likes to drive? Rick was nodding thoughtfully. Actually, that's not a bad idea. Clean up the loose end before it becomes a problem. I frantically saved the video file, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the controls. They were planning to kill me. These monsters, who had murdered my son, were now calmly discussing my death like they were planning a vacation. The beauty of it, Tiffany continued, is that Dorothy's been so grief-stricken, so confused about the house situation. If something happened to her now, people would just think the poor thing finally succumbed to the stress. Plus, Rick added with a grin that made me nauseous, she's got a decent life insurance policy. 25 grand. Not huge, but worth the effort. How did he know about my life insurance? Had Tiffany somehow accessed my personal papers? Jimmy stood up abruptly. Look, I helped you with Marcus because he was going to divorce Tiffany, and you'd lose everything. But killing old ladies? That's where I draw the line. Relax, Rick said. We're just talking. Dorothy's not going anywhere. But I could see in his eyes that he was already planning my demise. After Jimmy left, I watched Rick and Tiffany discuss specifics. A staged car accident seemed to be their preference, something that would look like an elderly driver losing control. They even debated locations, finally settling on a sharp curve about 15 miles outside town. We'll need to disable her brakes, Rick mused. Make it look like mechanical failure. How long? Tiffany asked. Give me 2 days to set it up. Then we can put our grieving daughter-in-law act back on for the funeral. Daughter-in-law. The word made me sick. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of my apartment, thinking. I had everything I needed to destroy them. Clear video evidence of them confessing to Marcus's murder and planning mine. But I also knew how the system worked. Defense lawyers could argue the footage was taken illegally, claim it was inadmissible, tie up the courts for years while these monsters walked free. No, I needed something more definitive. Something that would put them away forever, with no possibility of escape. As I sat there planning my next move, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Having trouble sleeping, Dorothy. You should be more careful driving these days. Roads can be so dangerous for someone your age. They knew where I lived. They were already watching me. But here's what Tiffany and Rick had forgotten in their rush to play criminals. I'd spent 35 years dealing with bullies, manipulators, and sociopaths in teenage form. I'd learned to think 3 steps ahead, to turn their own arrogance against them. They wanted to play games? Fine. Game on. The next morning, I did something that would have shocked my old self. I called a criminal defense attorney. Not because I needed defending, but because I needed to understand exactly how to build an airtight case. Mrs. Williams, said attorney Patricia Reed after I'd explained my situation, what you have is compelling, but we need more. Defense lawyers will argue that video taken without consent is inadmissible. What if they confess to additional crimes while being recorded legally? Patricia raised an eyebrow. That would change everything. But how would you manage that? I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in months. Leave that to me. My next call was to Detective Collins, but this time I had a different strategy. Detective, I want to report a threat against my life. That got her attention. Within an hour, she was sitting in my apartment while I showed her the threatening text message. Mrs. Williams, this could be anyone. A prank, maybe. What if I told you I have reason to believe my daughter-in-law and her boyfriend killed my son for his insurance money? That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? I pulled out my phone and played a carefully edited clip, just Rick talking about phase 2 and needing to clean up loose ends. Nothing illegal about how I'd obtained it, just a concerned mother-in-law who'd happened to overhear something disturbing. Detective Collins listened intently. Mrs. Williams, I need you to come to the station tomorrow. We're going to need a full statement. After she left, I made one more call. To my old principal, Frank Morrison, who'd retired the same year I did. Dorothy, good to hear from you. How are you holding up? Frank, I need a favor. Remember that time you helped catch those students dealing drugs by setting up that elaborate sting operation? Of course. Why? I need to borrow some of that tactical thinking. And maybe your nephew who works for the phone company. By evening, I had my plan. It was risky, maybe stupid, but it was the only way to get the kind of evidence that would put Rick and Tiffany away forever. I sent Rick a text from a burner phone. Jimmy told me about your problem with Dorothy. I can help. Meet me tomorrow at the old warehouse on Industrial Road. Come alone. A friend. Then I settled in to wait, watching the camera feeds as Rick and Tiffany tried to figure out who their mysterious benefactor might be. Could be anyone, Rick said, pacing the living room. Jimmy's got connections all over town. What if it's a trap? Tiffany asked. What trap? Nobody knows anything. And if someone's offering to help us solve the Dorothy problem, we'd be stupid not to listen. Perfect. Arrogance was always their weakness. The old Hartwell warehouse had been abandoned for 15 years, a relic from when this town had actual industry. I arrived 2 hours early, setting up my equipment with the help of Frank's nephew, Tony, who'd installed a dozen hidden microphones throughout the building. You sure about this, Mrs. Williams? Tony asked, adjusting the wireless transmitter in my purse. These guys sound dangerous. They are dangerous. That's why we're doing this properly. Detective Collins and 2 other officers were positioned outside, ready to move on my signal. Everything we recorded would be admissible because Rick was meeting me voluntarily in a public place to discuss criminal activity. At exactly 3 p.m., Rick's truck pulled into the parking lot. He got out alone, looking around nervously before approaching the warehouse entrance. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, and his face went through several expressions before settling on confused wariness. Dorothy, what the hell are you doing here? Waiting for you. Rick, we need to talk. You sent that text? He looked around, clearly wondering if this was some kind of setup. Smart man. Too bad he wasn't smart enough. Surprised. You shouldn't be. Did you really think I'd just roll over and die because you and Tiffany decided I was inconvenient? His hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Look, old lady, I don't know what you think you know. I know you killed my son. I know you drugged him and sent him to his death. I know you're planning to kill me too. I kept my voice steady, conversational. What I want to know is why you're so sloppy about it. Rick's face had gone pale. You're crazy. Marcus died in an accident. Really? Then explain this. I pulled out my phone and played the audio from 2 nights ago, crystal clear recordings of him confessing to murder. The color drained completely from his face. Where did you get that? Does it matter? The question is, what are you willing to do to keep it from reaching the police? Now I had his full attention. This was the crucial moment. Get him to incriminate himself further or risk everything on what I already had. What do you want? He asked quietly. I want the truth. All of it. Why Marcus? What was worth killing him for? Rick glanced around one more time, then seemed to make a decision. Fine. You want the truth? Your precious son was going to divorce Tiffany. We'd have gotten nothing. She'd been married to him less than 2 years. No alimony, no community property, nothing. So, you killed him for money. We killed him because he was about to destroy our future. Tiffany and I have been together for 3 years. Since before she married your son. 3 years. My mind reeled. She was cheating the entire time? Cheating? Rick laughed bitterly. Lady, she married him for his money. The whole thing was planned from the beginning. When he got rich, we knew we'd hit the jackpot. But then he started getting suspicious, talking about hiring private investigators. So you murdered him. We solved a problem, and now you're a problem too. Rick's hand was definitely moving toward his jacket now. Lucky for me, you decided to make this easy by coming here alone. Who says I'm alone? The warehouse lights suddenly blazed on, and Detective Collins's voice echoed through the space. Police! Don't move! Rick spun around, finally understanding that he'd walked into exactly the trap Tiffany had worried about. But by then, it was too late. They had everything they needed, recorded in perfect clarity. As they cuffed him, Rick looked at me with pure hatred. You think this is over? Tiffany will never talk. You can't prove anything about Marcus. I smiled, feeling a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced in years. Oh, Rick, you have no idea what's coming next. While Rick was being processed downtown, I was watching Tiffany on my camera feeds, pacing the house like a caged animal. She'd been calling Rick's phone for 2 hours with no answer. By evening, she was frantic. That's when Detective Collins and I made our second house call. Tiffany Williams? Detective Collins showed her badge. We need to speak with you about your husband's death and some new evidence that's come to light. Tiffany's face was a mask of confused innocence. Evidence? I don't understand. Marcus died in a car accident months ago. May we come in? Of course. Tiffany stepped aside, and I followed Detective Collins into my former home. The place reeked of Rick's cologne and Tiffany's desperation. Mrs. Williams, we've arrested Richard Patterson in connection with your husband's death. He's made some very serious accusations. Rick? Arrested? Tiffany's performance was flawless. Shock, confusion, mounting panic. What accusations? Detective Collins set a digital recorder on the coffee table. We'd like you to listen to something. Rick's voice filled the room, clear and damning. We killed him because he was about to destroy our future. Tiffany and I have been together for 3 years. I watched Tiffany's face crumble as she heard her lover confess to everything. But instead of breaking down, she did something I didn't expect. She laughed. You think that proves anything? Rick's lying. He's obviously trying to save himself by blaming me. Is he lying about your 3-year relationship? Detective Collins asked. Rick is delusional. He's been obsessed with me since Marcus hired him to do some work on the house last year. I've been trying to let him down easy because he seemed unstable. The woman was good. If I didn't know better, I might have believed her myself. What about the insurance money? I asked quietly. Tiffany turned to me with what looked like genuine hurt. Dorothy, how can you believe these lies? I loved Marcus. I'm still grieving. Cut the act, Tiffany. I have video of you planning my murder. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. That's impossible. Detective Collins nodded to me, and I pulled out my phone, playing the footage from 3 nights ago. Tiffany's own voice filled the room. Maybe Dorothy needs to have an accident too. For the first time, genuine fear crossed Tiffany's face. But she recovered quickly. That's not my voice. Rick must have manipulated the audio somehow. He's been threatening me, trying to make me go along with his fantasies about Marcus. I was terrified of him. Detective Collins looked at me. This was the moment we'd planned for. The moment when Tiffany would try to pin everything on Rick. If you were so terrified, I said, why did you give him a key to this house? Why is his DNA all over Marcus's personal belongings? Why did you clean out Marcus's office the day after the funeral? I was in shock. People do irrational things when they're grieving. Stop. Detective Collins held up her hand. Mrs. Williams, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. As they read Tiffany her rights, she looked directly at me. The mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman underneath. You meddling old bitch, she hissed. You should have minded your own business. My son's murder was my business, I replied calmly. As they led her away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Marcus died. Peace. But the biggest surprise was still to come. The call came from Detective Collins 3 days after Tiffany's arrest. Mrs. Williams, we need you to come to the station. There's been a development. I found her in the same interview room where we'd first discussed Marcus's case. She looked tired but satisfied. We found something interesting when we searched Rick's apartment, she began, sliding a folder across the table. Financial records, correspondence, photos. Turns out your son's murder was just the beginning. I opened the folder and felt the world tilt again. Bank statements showing deposits from multiple insurance companies. Photos of at least 6 different women, all older, all wealthy-looking, and correspondence with someone named Janet Morrison, Rick's previous girlfriend, who died in a house fire just 8 months before Marcus met Tiffany. They're serial killers? I whispered. We think so. We've contacted police departments in 4 states about suspicious deaths that match their pattern. Rich, older men or women with younger partners who die in convenient accidents shortly after updating their insurance beneficiaries. The scope of it was staggering. Marcus wasn't just a victim. He was part of a carefully orchestrated killing spree that had been going on for years. "There's more," Detective Collins continued. "Rick's been talking, trying to cut a deal. According to him, Tiffany is the mastermind. She scouts the targets, Rick handles the technical aspects of the murders. They've made over $2 million in the past 5 years. $2 million. 20-some lives destroyed for money. But here's the part that might interest you most," Detective Collins said, pulling out another document. "Your son figured it out." "What do you mean?" "Marcus had been conducting his own investigation. We found files hidden in his cloud storage, photos, financial records, even recordings. He knew exactly what Tiffany was, and he was building a case against her." The document was a draft email Marcus had written but never sent, dated just 2 days before his death. "Mom, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I've discovered that Tiffany isn't who she claimed to be. Her real name is Jennifer Walsh, and she's wanted in connection with at least 3 suspicious deaths in Nevada. I've been gathering evidence, but I think she's becoming suspicious. I've left everything in a safety deposit box at First National. The key is taped under my desk drawer. If anything happens to me, please give this information to the police. I'm sorry I got us into this mess. I love you, Marcus." I stared at the letter through tears, pride and heartbreak warring in my chest. My son had been trying to protect me, even as he was walking into a trap. "Why didn't he just leave her?" I asked. According to his notes, he was afraid she'd disappear and start over somewhere else. He wanted to make sure she was stopped permanently. Marcus had died trying to be a hero, and in the end, he'd succeeded. His evidence was helping convict his own killers. "There's one more thing," Detective Collins said gently. "The insurance money Tiffany was expecting? Marcus changed the beneficiary 3 weeks before he died. He left everything to you." I looked up sharply. "What?" $2.7 million. "Mrs. Williams, your son made sure that even if something happened to him, Tiffany would get nothing." As I walked out of the police station that afternoon, I realized Marcus had taught me one final lesson. Sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure justice is served. But I wasn't quite finished yet. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse watching as Tiffany, whose real name was indeed Jennifer Walsh, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rick got the same sentence. Both had been convicted on multiple counts of murder in the first degree. The courtroom was packed with family members of their other victims. I'd met many of them over the past months, bonding over our shared grief and shared determination to see justice done. As the judge read the sentences, I thought about Marcus. He would have been proud of how this ended, not with vigilante justice or personal revenge, but with the law working exactly as it should. After the hearing, I drove to the cemetery where my son was buried. I'd been coming here every week, but today felt different. Final, somehow. "We got them, sweetheart," I said, placing fresh flowers on his grave. All of them. The insurance money had allowed me to do something I'd never dreamed possible. I'd started a foundation in Marcus's name to help families of murder victims navigate the legal system. We'd already helped 3 families get justice for their loved ones. I'd also bought back the house on Maple Street from the state when it was seized as evidence. But I wasn't living there anymore. Too many memories, both good and bad. Instead, I'd bought a smaller place across town with a perfect garden and room for visitors. Because it turned out I had more friends than I'd realized. All the people who'd helped me through the investigation, who'd believed in me when I thought I was just a paranoid old woman. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Collins. "Saw the news about the Michigan case. 3 more convictions thanks to Marcus's evidence. You should be proud." I was proud. Not just of Marcus, but of myself. I'd faced down killers, outsmarted criminals, and proven that being 67 years old didn't mean being helpless. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the young teachers I used to mentor, the ones who'd ask how to handle difficult students or impossible parents. "Trust your instincts," I'd always told them. "When something doesn't feel right, keep digging until you find the truth." It had taken me 67 years to fully follow my own advice, but better late than never. I'd learned that grief doesn't have to make you weak. Sometimes it can make you strong enough to fight for justice, smart enough to outthink criminals, and brave enough to risk everything for the truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win. as I drove home through the town where I'd lived my entire life. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine happiness. Not the temporary kind that comes from small pleasures, but the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a difference. Marcus was gone, and nothing would ever change that. But his killers would never hurt anyone else again. And maybe somewhere he was proud of his old mom for refusing to go quietly into the night. After all, I'd taught high schoolers for 35 years. Did Tiffany and Rick really think they could outsmart someone who dealt with teenage sociopaths for decades? They'd picked the wrong mother to mess with, and now they had the rest of their lives in prison to regret that mistake. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.